Thank you to the University of California at Santa Barbara and the East Asian Center, as well as I think originally Lisa reached out to me from the Center for Middle East Studies. So I want to thank everybody for having me and hosting me here today. I also thank everyone for, I'm not sure where you guys are, if you're on a quarter system, but this is the end of our semester and everyone's sort of feeling a little bit tired. So I really appreciate people coming out and hopefully I will contextualize some of the things that I talk about in my book for everyone here today. One sec, I'm just going to share my screen. Okay, so today I'm sort of going to give a broad overview of my book. I'm going to try to keep my presentation quite short in order to facilitate conversation and discussion. But I've titled my talk today, Supporting the Faith, Building the Empire, Imperial Japan's Policies in World War II. And when I started thinking about this book a very long time ago, I sort of had these two themes that were running through my head about how the Japanese Empire was thinking about supporting religious freedom, or at least expressing that they supported religious freedom, and how that related to the building and maintenance of their empire. So those are some of the sort of really big and broad questions that I approached my book project with. So I guess for those of you who have not had the opportunity to read my book, or for those of you who are sort of new to this topic, I had a couple of objectives when I started this project way back in grad school. And started thinking about this project, in around 2010, 2011. So the objectives that I had when I approached this project were to insert Sino-Muslims into the historiography of World War II. And anyone who's familiar with work on collaboration in East Asia during the Second World War sort of knows that there's a dearth of material, unlike in the European theater, where the work on Vichy France is a whole cottage industry within within French history. And so there is now quite a few works on Han-Chinese collaboration with the Japanese Empire, and specifically some very good stuff on Wang Jingwei and on people who collaborated in Manchuria, on Korean collaborators. But there's not really any work done on what we would consider to be ethnic minorities. And I guess just to sort of preface my talk, in case people aren't aware, the people that I'm talking about, the Sino-Muslims, are Chinese-speaking Muslims who have long been a part of the sort of intricate fabric of Chinese social life. They mostly live in urban cities all throughout China, and they're quite well connected to Han Chinese culture as well as to Muslim culture. So they're different than the Uyghurs or the Kazakhs or the Tajiks, who primarily operate in different spaces in China, but who also do not speak Chinese as their first language. And then I also wanted to reinstate agency to Sino-Muslims in early 20th century state building projects in China, and to show that these men and sometimes women had different choices. They did not just sort of follow this path to being a part of the Chinese Republic without questioning what that would mean for their own future. And for some of them, the Japanese Empire really provided them a space to explore reform ideas that they had wanted to implement within their own communities in ways that either the Chinese communists or the Chinese nationalists were not able to do. And another objective that I had with my book was to sort of examine the state building efforts on the margins among non-Han Chinese people. And I think that this is a sort of growing, something that's happening with more and more frequency as scholars sort of realize the importance of borderlands in the making of what we would consider to be the modern Chinese nation state. And I look to works like that recently came out, like Eric Schlussel's book, Land of Strangers, about the Qing Civilizing Project in Central Asia. And I think like my work and his work among others, sort of help us understand not only how the Chinese state was trying, had to sometimes work harder to sort of to implement state building efforts on the margins, but how when we refract some of the policies that they were implementing among minorities and ethnic minorities, it kind of gives us actually a better picture of how the Han Chinese saw themselves in this time period. So these two interrelated themes, what I'd like to do today is sort of show I'm going to pull out three examples from the book that I have written about and look at three sort of tangible policies that the Japanese Empire used to quote unquote support the faith. And so these three policies were the opening and supporting of Islamic schools, the sending of Hajj delegations to Mecca, so the sponsoring of at least one Hajj delegation to Mecca. And I'll briefly talk about this coordinated global tea policy as a way that I argue in the book to create that helped the Japanese Empire imagine not only the sort of spatial bounds of the imperial project well beyond what we would consider to be the greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere, but allowed them to also envision the creation of new Muslim consumers who would consume goods that were created and manufactured within Japan and its colonies. And then this relates to the theories, the ideas of building the empire, where I thought that I sort of saw that through propaganda, which featured Muslims as quote unquote success stories of the benevolence of the Japanese Empire, we sort of see how Muslims kind of get propped up as, these success stories of development. And this is not exceptional. The Nazis, as well as the Italian fascists, had similar types of policies that they were implementing. The Italians in North Africa, especially in Libya. And we all kind of can be very well aware of the fact that the Italian occupation of Libya and Ethiopia were completely brutal in retrospect. But at the time, Mussolini was trying to sort of curry favors to Muslim youths especially. And they did run a number of quite successful anti-ally radio channels with the help of the Nazis throughout the so-called Arab world. And then I think that one of the things that made Muslims and Muslim populations accessible and identifiable to Japanese strategists and to Japanese policymakers was the way that the propaganda that they created appealed to, number one, anti-Soviet and anti-imperial inclinations that many Muslims already held. This wasn't sort of some they didn't really need to go to the Dutch East Indies and explain why Muslims in Java should revolt against the Dutch. And they also didn't really need to go into Xinjiang and explain why the Soviets were, why they needed to be anti-Soviet. So this was sort of already in line with what their propaganda was saying. And I think that in many ways, the overlaps between Pan-Asianism and Pan-Islamism sort of intersect at these anti-Soviet and anti-imperial inclinations that many Muslims had already been discussing for years before the Japanese Empire entered the picture. So the research questions that I came to this project with when I really started, this project actually came out of a number of different, sort of started to germinate in my first year of graduate school when I took a class about collaboration in World War II. And realized that the only book out there was Tim Brooks' book called Collaboration, which was completely shocking to me. And so I started to think about why and how non-Han Chinese populations could and would have worked with the Japanese Empire. And around the same time, one of my PhD supervisors, a man named Jonathan Littman, who is essentially the grandfather of the study of Islam in China, sent me a large stack of articles in Japanese while I was learning Japanese in grad school to sort of work my way through about Muslim policy during the Second World War. And sort of these things started to like percolate in my mind. And the big questions that I started asking were, what were the Japanese motivations for supporting Muslims in China? And what did they hope to benefit from this support? Were they actually successful? Why and how? And what do their efforts tell us about the position of Muslims in China in the 1930s? And how did the Chinese nationalists and the Chinese communists respond to these overtures that the Japanese were making? So with that, I've come to a number of conclusions that I hope are evident. It's that the Japanese were actually successful in recruiting Muslim populations in occupied China through specific policies, but only to a certain degree. And one of the things that I found was that there was no sort of blanket implementation of a policy, and that they had to sort of react to the Japanese imperial apparatus had to react to situations on the ground, depending on pushback or demands that were made by Sino-Muslim populations. So I think there was an awareness among elite Sino-Muslims, especially ones who lived in places like Beijing, where they would have had their sort of ear on the ground and were very well in tune and connected to politics. They were sort of aware of their value and made sure to sort of get the things that they wanted out of the Japanese empire. And then I also in the book argue that the Chinese nationalists, as well as the Chinese communists, were very well aware of Japanese efforts to curry favors to Muslims and responded to these Japanese successes in kind. And so one of the arguments that I'm making is that a lot of the sort of ethno-nationalist policy of the Chinese nationalists during the wartime was, number one, a reaction to the fact that they were confronted with living amongst minority populations, perhaps for the first time when they were forced to move to Chongqing. They'd sort of been a coastal party where there are not that many minorities, but in Chongqing, obviously, there are all kinds of minority populations. And then they're also, responding to the successes, the quote unquote successes that the Japanese, they perceive among the Japanese empire. So I think that the Japanese did actually have an important impact on the Chinese nationalist, ethno-nationalist policies during the war. And one of the projects I'm sort of thinking about now is to examine some of the repercussions of these policies on the early ethno-nationalist policies of the PRC in the early 1950s, and as well as on the KMT. So I'll talk a little bit about that at the end. So some of the conclusions that I draw are that Sino-Muslims who participated in empire building projects came to be called what Robert Cruz, in his fabulous book, Afghan Modern, identifies as quote unquote imperial cosmopolitans, and that these people never imagined themselves as peripheral to the rest of the world. And in fact, they participated actively in the Islamic world through Tokyo. And sometimes we're able to participate much more actively in this quote unquote Islamic world through their affiliation with the Japanese empire. There was no united Muslim voice of resistance against the Japanese during World War II, but rather a plethora of voices with competing agendas. And this sort of goes straight in the face of talks to the PRC narrative that, the war, it was the war of resistance and everyone is unified in resistance against the Japanese. And I think that's just too simple of a story. We know that it's a lot more complicated than that. And there were many people who were interested in working with different benefactors. And in the words of Adib Khalid in his book, Making Uzbekistan, I think that the Japanese in Muslims were able to locate different actors and examine how they mobilized both symbolically and materially to achieve their goals. So with that, I'm going to move to some of these more strategic policies that were implemented and think about the sort of ways that the Japanese empire went about implementing these specific policies. So one of the first things, the Japanese empire or Japanese intellectuals in the late 19th century started getting interested in Islam, mostly through a number, they were after the Iwakura missions and other missions that went to the Middle East, they were sort of interested in learning about places that perhaps they had not been familiar with before. But it wasn't really until the Russo-Japanese War where we have more and more Japanese military spending time on the Chinese mainland, coming in contact with Muslim populations in North China, that there sort of is a burgeoning of an intellectual community in Japan that's dedicated to studying the history of Islam, but also the history of Islam on the Chinese mainland. And I guess the biggest problem was that there's really no Muslims in Japan at this time. Very few, very little knowledge among the general population about Islam. And so this is going to be one of their biggest problems. And so after the Russian Revolution, through connections made with a Volga Tatar, a number of Volga Tatar refugees make their way to Siberia and then to Tokyo, where they're settled in Tokyo. Some people say they were naturalized, and I'm not aware that they were, but they essentially become this really important propaganda outlet for the Japanese imperial project, is sort of presenting themselves not only as supporters of people who resisted the Soviet Union, but also as protectors of a Muslim population. And so here in 1936, they sort of trot out some of these young Tatar Muslim women who are attending a school that's been built for them, and they're praying for the success of the Japanese-German alliance against Bolshevism. And then this is just some propaganda, this comes from a magazine called Kodomo, about kids, a children's magazine. And the publication of this magazine coincided with the opening of the Tokyo Mosque in May 1938. And this is just a sort of little spread about the Tokyo Islamic School and these young children. And they're, on the side here, it says that they're practicing Arabic, but that's actually not Arabic. It's a language that we would probably call East Turkestani, which is a predecessor of, based on Chagatai, and the predecessor of, modern Uyghur or similar languages that are sort of come out of that period. And then this is obviously this other young pupil is learning Japanese. So just showing that, the Japanese Empire is supporting these students. They're allowing them to learn their own indigenous languages, and how well and how they're thriving in Japan. This is a photo taken by the Japanese Islamic Association of one of these young women learning Japanese in school. So all that to say, by the time after the establishment of Manchukuo and a number of Muslim schools coming under their control, the Japanese Empire had a way of handling. They kind of knew what to do. And so they were opening a number of Islamic schools, or a number of Islamic schools came under their direct control. And they went into some of these places and implemented curriculum changes, or asked the schools to sort of think about ways to amend the curriculum that would include Japanese language learning. So this is a report that I talk extensively about in my book by a Japanese intellectual who got sort of brought into the service of empire. His name is Kobayashi Hajime. And in 1939-40, he started collecting data. And this was actually republished in 1941. And this is a report on Islamic schools that are under Japanese control. And he went to a number of different schools and sort of monitored them. But what I think came out of it for me is that there seemed to always be a contestation between the Japanese Empire and the Muslim community about how many hours of Japanese language learning should be allowed in class in the school curriculum. And there was never any effort, from what I saw, to sort of get rid of Arabic language learning. They also understood that these children needed to speak Chinese and learn Chinese. And so what they were really trying to do was create this sort of trilingual, or have this trilingual group of students who could speak Chinese, Japanese, and Arabic, and then eventually could be sort of deployed in the service of empire. And one of the things that I found sort of striking about this when I started reading, especially in reports about competitions that were hosted by the Japanese Empire for speaking competitions, it seemed that the majority of the people who were winning these were young women. And so this was like, I think that in some ways this created a space for young women to perhaps engage in education in a way that they might not have been able to in the past. And perhaps their parents sort of saw the value of them learning Japanese and, maybe getting a clerical job. Because, it's 1938, 1939, 1940. It's anyone's war at this time. No one, no one's assuming that the Japanese are going to lose. And so a number of these young women actually got the opportunity to travel to Tokyo if they sort of ranked high enough within these language speaking contests. Some of them were presented with opportunities to get scholarships to study in Tokyo. And so these are some photos from that one of these excursions. Here we can see these young women participating in some sort of like first aid ceremony or first aid training. And then here they are walking around, and then here they're visiting a university in Tokyo, as well as participating in a tea ceremony. So visiting a tea farm and then, having some tea afterwards. And just as a sort of a little bit of an aside, I think that the way that the education was especially important for the way that the Japanese Empire wanted to present itself to other non-Western empires. And they worked very purposefully to create propaganda about the Japanese education system for distribution in the Middle East. So these are from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs archives, just kind of keeping track of all of the articles that are published in Arabic magazines about the sort of successes of the Japanese school system. And so how did these policies sort of expand and move and, they start in Tokyo with these young Tatar students in the 1920s and 30s, and then they sort of expand to Manchukuo. And then by the time that the Japanese occupy this large swath of territory, and all of these different peoples come under their control, especially in places like Burma, what will become Indonesia, and in the Philippines that has a large Muslim population, they kind of already have a playbook that they can institute. And so this is a photo of some 3 Moro students who are in Tokyo learning Japanese in 1943. And they were there with a group of students from places like Afghanistan, Pakistan, what will become Pakistan, China, the Dutch East Indies, Burmese Muslims. So there's this sort of space that all of these different young students are occupying, all of these students from all over East Asia and Southeast Asia. And it's most likely that the language that they would speak together would have been Japanese. And these young students, after they'd finished their Japanese training, they were actually there to go to the police academy. So then they would essentially be sent back to the Philippines in order to, become police officers who worked in the service of empire. Okay, so this is a little bit of a segue into the conversation about the second policy, and that has to do with the with the sending of a Hajj delegation of 5 Chinese Muslims to Saudi Arabia. And the purpose of that delegation, the purpose of that Hajj was essentially to see if the Japanese Empire could secure an oil concession in Saudi Arabia. So the culmination of all of the work that they put in to sending these 5 men who would become Hajis to, on this sort of religious pilgrimage, was that they were supposed to sort of grease these diplomatic wheels and get Japanese diplomats in the door in order to try to negotiate for an oil concession. But this story really starts at the opening of Tokyo Mosque in May 1938, where this is actually, the Tokyo Mosque is the 3rd mosque that was built in Japan, but the other 2 before it in Kobe and Nagoya were actually built with money from South Asian benefactors. So people from India who lived in these areas and who got funds together to build a mosque. The Tokyo Mosque was built almost entirely with funds from the Japanese government. And the events that surrounded the opening of the mosque were a very international affair. Muslim dignitaries from all over the world were invited to attend, and many of them did. Some were forced to refuse because of their connections to colonial powers and in the Allies. But, we have people from Turkey, we have people from Central Asia, and this man in the middle, who is the first imam of the mosque, he is flanked here on either side by an Egyptian who is naturalized as a Saudi, and on the other side by a man named Prince Hussein, who is the 3rd son of Imam Yahya of Yemen. And so Imam Yahya sent his son, Prince Hussein, as the honorary guest of the opening of the Tokyo Mosque. And he spent a number of weeks in Shanghai before traveling to Tokyo. And the reason that he was actually the sort of honorary guest was that the Italian fascists in 1925 had made a strategic alliance with the Yemenis in order to sort of thwart off British influence on the Arabian Peninsula. So the Yemenis at this time were receiving large arms supplies from the Italians, and they had a sort of ongoing quote unquote friendship treaty with the Italians. So there's a sort of Axis connection that is the reason that he is there and such a prominent guest of honor at the opening of the mosque. And then this other man here, Hafiz Wahab, is an Egyptian but a naturalized Saudi, and here he is arriving at Haneda Airport in 1938. Someone pointed out to me a while ago that it might have been the reason that the Saudis might have actually used Wahab as a diplomat was that he wasn't actually Saudi, and so he could go to places like Japan, and he was the first ambassador to the Vatican. So living in this totally Catholic space. So he was sort of a proxy for the Saudis, and was able to visit these places that they would have not considered religious enough or not considered Muslim enough. So his presence there was important. He's a very important diplomat, but I think there's more to sort of figure out about why he was there. And the opening of the mosque was really important. It was a global it got global recognition. Again, these are newspaper clippings from the diplomatic archives in Tokyo of all of the different news stories that ran about the opening of the mosque in different newspapers. So we have one in Dutch and one in Arabic from a sort of French Arabic speaking country about this grandiose event. And so at the opening of this mosque, there were 5 delegates from the Chinese Muslim Association, and one of them was a man named Tang Yiten, who is one of the protagonists in my book. Here they are, here's the Chinese delegation visiting the Meiji Shrine in 1938. And while they were here, they were allegedly approached by Japanese officials to, they would sponsor them to go on a Hajj trip. So Tang actually wrote a very long journal. It's about 400 pages, which I read and translated mostly. It's pretty interesting. I sort of had to siphon it down into one chapter of the book, but all of the like really fun anecdotes my editor cut. So, you get a fairly sanitized version of his story. But he published it first in a serial, and then later it was published as a collection. And so, they have all of these troubles. They're traveling, obviously, late 1938, early 1939. Europe's almost about to go to war, and the British are adamant that these men are not going to get visas to go on a Hajj. So they actually end up taking an Italian ship and spending a number of weeks in Italian-occupied Eritrea before they secure passage across to Jeddah and perform their Hajj. But if you look at where they stop along the way in Hong Kong, Singapore, Colombo, and Mumbai, all of those places are obviously under British colonial control at the time. And in the book, it becomes quite clear that the Chinese nationalists have a very well-established security apparatus that is able to sort of follow and let these men know that the Chinese nationalists know that they're going on this trip. This is just a picture of a Hajj manual that perhaps they might have taken. I think this photo is so interesting, or this image is interesting. And then, as I mentioned, we have these Japanese diplomats, after this Hajj is complete, going to negotiate for an oil concession in April 1939, which was not successful. Essentially, the British and the Americans stepped in and kind of made sure that the Saudis presented the Japanese with an option that wouldn't have been viable for them. So who knows what would have happened in the exciting, thinking about what could have potentially happened had this gone through, things might have been very different. Okay, so the third direct policy that I sort of talk about in my book is this comes out of finding all of these really interesting documents produced by the Japanese Muslim Association about global tea policy and Japanese tea and Muslims. And Japanese tea at this time is, it's tea from Formosa, it's tea from the mainland, and it's really good Japanese tea from Japan. One of the things that sort of struck me as I was reading some of these documents was just how sort of global this policy was. And it really extended the reach of the Japanese Empire far beyond what we would typically consider to be the greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere, into places that we perhaps have not thought about as being places that the Japanese Empire was looking for markets in during the Second World War. But here, if we look at this, they're showing all the exports of Japanese tea and Chinese tea to different countries that, some of them are under European colonial control, some of them are not, and just sort of thinking about how they're imagining these spaces. And this, of course, is not really limited to tea. I use tea as an example, but we could this, I think, sort of illustrates the point I'm trying to make about the questioning the geographical confines of the greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere as a sort of space of circulation of Japanese goods. This is a map of the Muslim world and industrial products that are produced in Muslim countries, and you can see it, It encompasses the majority of North Africa, parts of the Middle East, India, and the majority of Southeast Asia as places where there's oil, there's cotton, there are domestic, there's industry, there's corn, there's wheat, and other products that could be used in facilitating trade with the Japanese Empire. Again, this is just a graph of Muslim oil producing countries. So that is sort of an overview of some of the things I talk about in my book. And I guess looking ahead, what my next project is I'm thinking of moving more into sort of a diplomatic history, tentatively called Islam and Politics in the East Asian Cold War. And I'm currently working on revisions on a paper that will hopefully be coming out in the fall, fingers crossed, about the nationalists in Taiwan and some of their efforts to reach out to anti-colonial and anti-communist Muslims as soon as they sort of arrived, as soon as they were sort of lost to the Chinese communists on the mainland. So this is a telegram that was sent by the president of the time in 1967 after Bai Chongxi retired, Shi Zizou, to Suharto, congratulating him on his successful coup in Indonesia and talking about how the two countries should work together to help fight communism throughout East and Southeast Asia. And so what I'm kind of trying to do here, I know that there's a lot of people that are working on the Cold War in Southeast Asia and East Asia, but there really seems to be a lack of inclusion, again, of these Muslim voices. And I think that oftentimes these Muslim actors sort of have disproportional representation to their size in the population because of their value in geopolitics. So for instance, in 1955, at the Bandung Conference, a large contingent of Sino-Muslims accompanied Zhou Enlai to the negotiations because they were familiar with the characters there and they sort of knew the sort of Islamic space better than Zhou did. And so the paper I'm working on that will hopefully be published soon starts actually at the Taipei Grand Mosque, which was one of the first buildings that was commissioned by the KMT after they started getting funds together to start building this essentially before they'd even lost as they started retreating to Taiwan. So before they'd even lost the Civil War. And this building, I've always been fascinated by it. Every time I go to Taiwan, I think it's really interesting. So I kind of wanted to write a paper about it. And they, much like the Japanese Empire, they had this large and elaborate opening ceremony where they invited Muslim dignitaries from all these these states throughout the world that were anti-communist to sort of come together and present this mosque as a sort of bulwark against communism, as well as a stepping place to sort of retake the mainland from the Chinese communists. And then, of course, the Japanese are included in this story. Many people sort of assume that in the post-52 era, the Japanese were sort of grappling to find connections to, get to the Middle East. But a lot of these connections were made during the war. And so I'm kind of curious to sort of look at the ways that these networks were reestablished and how a number of important Japanese Muslims reached out to Middle Eastern dignitaries in order to help facilitate trade and diplomacy between these spaces. And then finally, I can just end with this picture here. Here is Xi Zhongxun, who's the father of, obviously, Xi Jinping, with a number of Muslim dignitaries in the 1950s. And so, just again, thinking through how the CCP understood the place of Muslims in their own struggles beyond the PRC and in the PRC in the early years of after the establishment of the People's Republic of China. I think it is something that is worthy of further investigation. So I have talked long enough. I thank you all for your patience. I'm going to end the slideshow.